Hi there. It's a while since I've made a video, so what I want to do before I pick up where I left off, I want to just recap very quickly on where I'm up to with this project. I started off, well, what I'm trying to do, I think, is to kind of align some ideas to do with the origins of the bodily senses, how that relates to thought and cognition more generally, how cognition produces meaning through the actions and the accumulations of these bodily senses, and how that feeds into knowledge. And what I've been arguing, initially from a set of ideas to do with motor cognition and to do with various understandings to do with representation in very, very simple organisms, through to the building of more complex cognitive behaviors which may have initially been coming out of very, very straightforward reflex arcs, but building from that into capacities for prediction and control and sensory engagement, particularly around the possibilities for movement and the necessity to build a kind of sensory system which allows access to the environment to make use of this movement potential. And then coming from that to further complexities brought on by through representations, through the capacity to formulate abstractions and other cognitive processes, leading into an understanding of something that I'm generalizing as metaphor. But I'm not restricting that specifically to linguistic metaphor, although that's the one I tend to be using most, but other kinds of translation processes where the environment and one's relationship to the environment provides templates for other kinds of understanding, which I'm referring to, as I say, as metaphor. And then out of that metaphor, sets of meanings to do with ideas, concepts which don't have any direct sensory impact, things that we can't touch or taste, and which don't have any kind of real embodied experience, but nevertheless we can understand because of this metaphorical mapping, the provision of these templates drawn from embodied sensorially engaged experience. Right, I think that's where I'm up to. But the section I'm pretty much on right now is to do with how we understand this thing called knowledge, or a set of ideas to do with knowing and knowledge gathering processes. And I'm looking at a series of epistemological systems to see if there are common metaphors which underpin these systems of knowings that we have. I took a little bit of time on Michael Polanyi's understanding of the explicit and tacit knowledge, trying to argue a case that there's a very specific spatial metaphor in operation there, in which the explicit is conceptualized as being distant from the body and largely articulated using visual metaphors, whereas the tacit is understood as being either very close to the body or actually inside of the body, not accessible to vision, therefore not appropriate for visual metaphors, but rather accessed through tactile or haptic or somatic metaphors, perhaps metaphors of taste even, possibly. So it's this dimension, this extended dimension out in space that I think is providing a lot of the information, that's the part of the sensory template which we're using to organize different understandings of knowing and knowledge. And in the last video I had completed talking about Polanyi's tacit and explicit. I'd moved on to the data, information, knowledge, wisdom hierarchy, which was formulated some years ago by Aikoff and a number of others. And I'd just finished talking about data in the data, information, knowledge, wisdom hierarchy. And what I want to try to do today is just say a little bit about, well, I want to talk about information, and if there's time I'll start talking about the concept of knowledge as it features there. It's going to be a little bit confusing because sometimes I realise I'm using the word knowledge, or possibly knowing, to refer to that whole system of engagements that we have that we call knowledge. But knowledge is also one of the elements within the DIKW, the data, information, knowledge, wisdom hierarchy. We'll just have to see how that goes. So I'm going to be reading this, and as I say, I'm picking up from where I left off talking about data, So now I'm going to be talking about information. Okay, moving up the hierarchy to information. The way this is conceived metaphorically shows significant overlap with data. It is similarly conceptualized as being corpuscular and discrete, with each item of information being imaginable as distinct from every other. There is also a shared sense of its being out there, pre-existing our efforts to acquire it. Also, with both data and information, when the volume of either is large, we begin to think of this in terms not of a collection of discrete particulate objects, but as a kind of liquid. We might talk of the flow of information, or of drowning in an excess of it. In this sense it retains some of the properties of the corpuscular, but also, like sand through an hourglass, can pass like a liquid. This metaphor of substance that varies between solidity and liquidity may have its origins in the affordances that different substances present to the body, and a reading of the metaphor in terms of affordances also starts to allow a distinction to be identified between data and information. So I just want to say a little bit about affordances to see if that can help us to unpick the data-information distinction. Okay, affordance is the term that J.J. Gibson gives to the properties of physical entities that we perceive and to which we respond in an embodied way. So, for example, the handle of a tool presents itself to the body in such a way that its handleability is experienced as a part of the perception of that object. In fact, the primary perception. Gibson says that we identify an object's function, its affordance, as he says, prior to our identification of its more physical features, its size, its colour, its shape. The first thing we perceive, he says, is its use function, its affordance, its primary perception. As part of a metaphor of information, then, if we are looking for a substance metaphor which embodies this sense of there being something that might be grasped, as well as the possibility of there being too much for us to grasp, then substance metaphors are singularly appropriate. Small, manageable amounts of information are conceptualized as hard particles of solid material, whilst an excess of information is understood as being impossible to get a handle on, hard to grasp, or slippery, and we run the risk of drowning in it. In this latter regard, such a metaphorical substance acquires the properties of a liquid. It might also be intuited from this use of the language of affordance that there is, in the distinguishing of information from data, the beginnings of an implied human agent figuring in the ground of the epistemology. Even though we have conceived of data in substantive terms, the presence of the body as the provider of an affordance to that substance is minimal. We tend not to think of data as being in a relationship to our bodily self. As we begin to consider the organization of information, however, there is a tacit understanding that such substance is under the approach of an intentional agent, the provider of significant form. There is the feeling that what was previously inert data is beginning to lean in our direction and organize itself into structures of information which at least have the possibility of purchase, even if our grasp is inadequate and the structure too frail. It's almost as if we're kind of orienting ourselves in a position to this, what was raw data, and in orienting ourselves such that we can get a kind of maximum grip on it, if you like, we are transforming it into information. It's the relationship, this orientation relationship that we're establishing, that is converting the data to information. Jonathan Hay, in the essay The Data Information Knowledge Chain, draws out this epistemological distinction in the metaphor, suggesting that the point at which information parts company with data is in the sense of what Hay calls attributes. He draws our attention to the fact that information can be sensitive or pertinent. It can be more or less salient or valuable in a way that raw data cannot. These attributes, which are awarded to the information in such a way that they seem to be part of its ontology, are actually derived from the relationship established between such potential information and the origin of this potential, which is the purposive human user. Okay, that's where I'll leave it, I think. Thanks very much.